Sascha Wunsch. I'm an assistant professor for political science and European integration at the Centre d'Études Européennes who organized the conference here. And I'm very happy to welcome with us today both the TEPSA recommendation team. As you heard from Jim, TEPSA prepares a set of recommendations for the incoming Council Presidency. And we are very happy that David Cvach, the Director of the European Union at the French Ministry of European and Foreign Affairs, has agreed to come to us and to share with us both his thoughts on the French Council Presidency's priorities, so a kind of preview of Macron's press conference, if I dare put it in those terms. And he then also agreed to remain available to respond to the recommendations that the TEPSA team has formulated. Some of the team, the main coordinating team, is sitting here on the podium with me. The remaining authors are in the room and will be coming up and presenting their recommendations too. And Mr. Cvach will be available to respond to these. So with this, I hand over to you for the peak preview.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Protocol would actually require that I be at the very moment at the Quai d'Orsay with the Prime Minister, our Minister, a number of other ministers who are welcoming today the conference of the presidents of the various committees of the French Parliament, which is customary before a presidency starts. But I was allowed to slip out of that meeting for this discussion, which I think you should take as a sign of how important it is for our policymakers to have an engaged dialogue with the think tankers, with the youth, and this in a very broad European perspective, which is why I'm so happy to do this with Sciences Po and particularly with TEPSA. As was said, your sense of timing is exquisite. Until recently, I didn't know that it would be today that the priorities would be unveiled. So maybe you knew something I didn't. But indeed, it will be at 4 p.m. This afternoon. And my whole game will be, of course, to talk about the priorities without talking about the priorities. I've been doing this for a while now, so you will tell me how good I am at this. But then the priorities will be mentioned, and you have, I see, 2 days of discussion where you will be able to go more into detail on the specific items, including with my fellow deputy Cyril Picmal, who will join you the day after tomorrow. Tomorrow, I think. Maybe I should say where I'm speaking from. The Direction de l'Union Européenne is actually not really what its title can seem, because I'm of course not heading the EU. I'm heading the EU department in the French Ministry for European Foreign and European Affairs. It's not actually even only the EU, because in my portfolio I deal with countries who are not in the EU, not yet in the EU, no more in the EU. So my empire goes from the UK to Romania, Bulgaria. It does not include, strangely, the Western Balkans, but it may at some point. And also maybe a word on the setup, because it's different in every EU country. Every EU country has the same challenge when it's dealing with the EU affairs, that EU affairs are not completely foreign affairs, they are not completely domestic affairs. So what do you do? Do you deal with it from the foreign ministry? Do you deal with it from something around your prime minister's office or your president's office? Do you do a mix? There are only bad solutions. I think our bad solution is actually the one that works best for us, which is that in our institutional setup, we ensure that everyone does what they do best. So the Sherpa for Europe at the Élysée, close to the president, he kind of tells us where to go. Matignon, the Prime Minister's office, with the Secrétariat Général aux Affaires Européennes, does, I actually don't know how you say arbitrage in English. but it makes sure that the various ministries come up with a consistent position in order to instruct our permanent representation in Brussels. And I am, and my ministry is one of the ministries around the table, and my job is to make sure that it maybe, I will say between us, maybe what it says has a particular weight, because we are also in close contact, daily contact with the presidency. We're in charge of crafting the policy, and we rely on a network of embassies in the EU. And I'll come back to that maybe a bit later in my introduction, although I know I have to keep it, of course, this being Sciences Po, at 10 minutes. So maybe I'll say 3 points which I thought about after reading your recommendations that we will discuss at length, and that I'm very thankful for. The first one may be also for the sake of discussion and to be a bit provocative, because it also in the few words of introduction, I could pick up this notion that there is French interest on one side and European interest on the other side. And please don't be too French. Please don't be too French, be European. This is something I also hear quite a lot from our EU colleagues, but it comes with a twist. Of course, by being too French, they mean that somehow we could use our presidency to push down the throat of the others our agenda, which I don't think is actually a credible proposition, but let's assume it is. At least many people seem to think it is, which is why they come and tell us, please don't go that way, because Europe is about consensus and cooperation and you know, taking a higher view than just a strict short-term national interest. But it never stops there. And then I see almost every country has a few issues that matter to them that they would really like us to push, in fact. So I've summed it up by not being too French, except when being French suits the others. So in fact, we should not be French when it's strictly a French ID, but if it's an Italian ID, or if it's a Lithuanian ID, or if it's a Bulgarian ID, then it would actually be very good if the French presidency could take this forward. I mean, it's an interesting intellectual exercise. I should say, in my job, I've never been confronted with, on one hand, a French position, on the other hand, a European position, and I had to make the difficult moral choice between the two. The issue is what you do at the national level, what you do at the European level, how you mix, what is the right combination between the two. I firmly believe that every European country sees the EU as a way to maximize its national interest. And we should be grateful for that. That's why the EU is resilient. If it was only relying on the thinking that we are building a post-national world, it would just not work, because maybe once in a while you would have a government here or there who believes that. It would not be sustainable. It would fuel the narrative that the EU is against the nations, and it would not work. One country, and sorry, on this issue of articulation, of course, national, you can do 100%. 100% you decide what you want to do. But then, if you go at the EU level, of course, you don't get 100% of what you want. You get less. So the arbitrage, again, the decision you have to make is, okay, if I try to do this at the EU level, how likely am I to be able to get a reasonable percentage of what I want to achieve? And the benefit is that then it applies to a much broader space, and therefore it has much more weight. That's the question. And then, of course, if you go the European way, you're not going to go the European way one day because it suits your interest, but not the other day because it doesn't. You commit to working together on a specific number of issues. One country had managed to get an extraordinary deal, and as a diplomat, I kind of admire that, of having really an ability to rely on the EU when it wanted and to opt out when it did not. Of course, the UK. And you would think they would have wanted to stay in this position forever. They had crafted this this beautiful way of being very national, while at the same time using the EU when it was good for them. And what I think we've discovered is that this apparently beautiful Goldilocks equilibrium is actually wrong, because if you do this, it means if you look at the EU only in this kind of opportunistic way, then your public will always wonder if you've got the right deal, and at some point they will choose to leave. I don't want to be too long on this national European thing, but still, I think it's critical, and it comes up so much in your papers. I think small countries, by size, are very comfortable with this because they see the EU. I think it's evident for them that the EU is actually helping them way more. If you're Luxembourg, you know that being part of this helps you maximize your leverage. For bigger countries, it's ambiguous because they can always think, I'm not saying it's true, that they would be better doing this or that alone. And I think the most difficult is when you have a country that is big by size and but feels that other countries who are of similar size are getting a much more influence at the EU level than they do and that they should. I think that's the real thing that I've actually read behind some of the arguments in your recommendations. And maybe I'll come back to that as well later. So what does this all mean for the presidency's priorities? In fact, we are extremely aware, this being our 13th presidency, that being president is actually not a time when you try to force the others to implement your agenda, but quite the opposite, a time when you have to be an honest broker between all 27 member states. And your first duty is to bring forward the legislation that is on the table. So we are being characteristically modest when it comes to our presidency. We intend to play that role. We, of course, intend to play it with a lot of ambition. And if I try to see where is the specifically French element in it, where is it different from the previous or further other presidencies, one is, of course, in your priorities. If we're honest, we are not defining our priorities, we are selecting our priorities. Because what you do as a presidency is that you take the 250 texts that are being negotiated in Brussels, and you choose those on which you are going to really make an effort. That's what we mean by priorities, essentially. You can add a couple of new priorities, but if you do, you will not deliver on them if they are legislative, because you put them in the pipe. You can hope to do it with give a maximum momentum, but it's the presidencies after you who will have to continue this work. So if we were to put a completely crazy French idea out there, it would die in the following presidency. So even when you put new ideas, you have to be European. You have to think if it flies at the EU level. So if I look at our priorities without, of course, anticipating on what the president will say, some of them are the priorities of the previous and will be the priorities of the following presidencies, because they are the priorities of everybody at the national level, in the US, in many countries in the world. Of course, the climate transition, and of course, the digital transition. So we have, on the climate transition, we have a package of 13 texts. You will discuss this, I think, later, that have been presented in July, and we will try to move them forward as far and as fast as we can, because the sense of urgency is extreme. Digital, two huge texts. You already know one, which is called Gdpr, which regulates privacy online. That has become a standard in the world, because that's what happens when the EU takes a decision on the biggest market in the world. It becomes a standard. We hope we will do the same on those two big pieces of legislation, which are the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which regulates, to make it very simple, respectively, content that you have online and the behavior, or let's say the anti-competitive behavior of big platforms. This is everybody's priority, and we will do our best. Then we have a social priority. That's also already there in the picture, but we will put, I think, stronger emphasis on this. And it will also be based on texts that are being negotiated, in particular on the minimum wage at the EU level. And then we have inherited from previous presidencies a document that has started under the German presidency, which is called the Strategic Compass, which is, for the French in the room, what we call a livre blanc, or in our defense and security system. Usually, when a president comes in, there is this big review of threat assessment and policy to, multi-year policy to face them. We have now this being negotiated at the EU level, and we hope to adopt the strategic compass in March. So maybe on this aspect, this is also something any presidency would have to do, because it's there, and there was a time frame. But of course, we will put very strong emphasis on this, because we hope the French presidency will be a moment when the EU makes a leap in terms of, and I don't want here to go into the terminological debate that we spend so much time on, strategic autonomy, sovereignty, independence, etc. But we hope that in this field, where the EU is weak at the moment, it defines a credible plan to become little by little much stronger. In general, and I'm probably coming close to the end of my time, in general, I think it's very useful always when thinking about the EU to distinguish areas where it is already a power and areas where it's not. It's quite basic, I'm sorry, but a very useful distinction that is not often made. So if we look at trade, if we look at agriculture, we are a power. Those policies are essentially defined and negotiated at an EU level, and what is happening now is that we are starting to turn this power of our own market more into a policy and political tool. We are, not like the term really, but it gives you the idea, we're kind of weaponizing our domestic market to have an influence in the world. And that's not a small thing. European sanctions, that has a major impact on international crisis. It's the only reason why we could have, a few years back, a deal with the Iranian on the Iranian nuclear issue. The only reason. That was the leverage brought by EU sanctions. So in those areas, the EU is already a power. It has to become a more assertive power. In defense and security, the EU is not a power. And actually, in this area, we are less than the sum of our parts. If we take the trade, we are much more than the sum of our parts, because we've unified it at the European level, and when the European trade enforcer says something, everybody listens. When the EU says something on defense, for the moment, not many listen. And if you aggregate all the numbers of our defense spending at the national level, you come with reasonable numbers, but they mean nothing, because they cannot translate into a concrete, cohesive, collective action in terms of projecting power. So we should not pretend that we are strong when we are not. We are not. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous world out there, getting increasingly dangerous, and we believe it's essential for the EU as such to become stronger in this field in complementarity with NATO, because a lot of member states are also members of NATO. And I had other things to say, but I will stop, because otherwise I'll be too long, and I'm sure I'll find opportunities to inject them in our conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this tightrope act of speaking about the priorities without giving too much away. I think you gave us some insight already in what I think is a considerable overlap also between what the TEPSA team is recommending and some of the priorities that the French presidency will pursue in the next 6 months. So I would like to begin by turning the word over to my two co-panelists here from the main recommendation coordination team that will speak about precisely what you were kind of alluding to, this idea of Europeanizing the French presidency and the kind of the delicate equilibrium between finding ways to bring the European interest forward while of course considering the French priorities here too. So first of all, I'll hand the word to Ilke Torgor, who's an analyst with Real Institut Elcano. Tell us a little bit more about this main recommendation, which really is indeed how to Europeanize the French Council Presidency.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for the organization. And I don't even know if I remember how to speak in front of public, because for the last 2 years I was speaking in front of a screen. So I will do my best. I think I had some questions and notes prepared for David, but I think I will start with this question of how to Europeanize the French presidency. I'm sure Nicoletta will add up on that, but for me, this has two roots, this question, why we decided to put this title in our contribution. The first one is, we all know that politicians want to get re-elected. And if you give the presidency to a president who is running for his survival in power, it is, I think, just fair that we are all scared that this is going to become a national electoral domain. So the first starting point is that. But adding into that, why we are asking the Europeanization of French presidency is also the increasing role of the European Council in decision making. For me, as a person who is interested in EU institutions in general, this is kind of a problem. Because not that we don't know the national interests are important in the EU, it has always been important in the EU, but with the institutionalization of this European Council, we see that very important problems are brought there, of course, in line with negotiations and consensus building between member states, but we see that some groups or alliances of countries are way more vocal than the others, and even they bypass processes that are normally involving other EU institutions. So for me, these are two important points that could overshadow, or at least the elections could overshadow the French presidency, or this power dynamics between EU institutions in general could overshadow the presidency. But one more point, and Nicoletta will definitely go more over that, but we need alliances in the European Union. And these alliances should not always be the same usual suspects. And when we have such overarching challenges, you already named in the priorities, and you're very right, actually, because any other country would have the same priorities, the green transition, digital transition, social Europe, very important, also treated by Portugal very recently. I will add on top of that democracy, and in a broader sense, like including corruption and all the other dynamics inside and outside of the EU. When we have such overarching challenges in the Union, we need overarching alliances among member states. So that's a bit the introduction to how to Europeanize the French presidency. But without extending so much, because I have one proper question that is dedicated in this talk, is on the conference on the future of Europe. Because that's an area we are really scared that French are going to be French. Because this has been, even if so many are skeptical about the exercise, I think this has been at least a good start for a conversation on the future. But when the results will be harvested and how the next steps are going to be, are not, at least in my position, not so clear, and I cannot necessarily see what will become out of the conference beyond the French presidency. So if you could assure us a bit, at least, that we can continue to the conference somehow, or the French presidency or an alliance of countries have a plan to continue on that and kind of establish a tradition of collective thinking on what do we want to become when we are older in the European Union. I think that would be a very good first step to show us that French presidency is beyond French elections and beyond French ambitions in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilke. And I will turn the word right over to Nicoletta Pirozzi. She is the head of the EU Politics and Institutional Program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali and will focus mainly on the recommendations regarding strategic autonomy.
Yes, Natasha, thank you very much. I will follow up where Ilke left. Just to say, yes, that our main message was really to make sure that this presidency, for which we have a lot of expectations, will really be a sort of stepping stone in the process of European integration, because we really need it in this particularly dramatic moment for the European Union. So as I said, France is widely recognized as a possible driving force for this. On the other side, there are a lot of concerns about the tendency that we have seen in the past, and that you also mentioned in your introductory remarks, to put a new flag on the French goals. And there is one particular sector in which we see this risk particularly evident, which is European sovereignty and its corollary strategic autonomy. And that's why in our recommendation, we suggest to the French presidency to try to change the narrative to make it less divisive in Europe, like it has been so far. Namely, in particular, to reassure capitals in Central and Eastern Europe that this is not incompatible with the strong presence of the transatlantic alliance in our defense, but also in our foreign policy. And on the other side, to change also the method for implementing this strategic autonomy and trying to enlarge alliances well beyond the Franco-German engine, to include countries like Italy, Spain, and even beyond. Because on one side, we recognize there is a divergence in the understanding of this concept between France and Germany. And on the other side, we think that it's particularly important in this sector to involve as much partners as possible. So our question would be, how do you think to tackle these concerns, which are present undeniably in Europe? And what concrete actions you plan to take to Europeanize, meaning to make sure that strategic autonomy is really conceived as a concept responding to wider European interests and not merely French initiatives. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nicoletta. And if you would like to respond to some of these very concrete questions already put to you.
I'm trying, challenge will be to be short. Interesting that you say that the EU Council is growing in importance. I think you could make an argument that the Commission is growing in importance and that the Parliament is growing in importance and that the Council is actually, since the Lisbon Treaty, marginally decreasing in importance. And it would all be true to a certain extent. I think Luc van Middelaar is a very, very interesting, I recommend to the students here, a very interesting person to read on this dynamic between Council and Commission in particular. But to me, it's absolutely not obvious that we're in a phase where the Council would be kind of growing in an unbalanced way with the other institutions, and that therefore this would reduce the kind of communitary spirit that we have. We've recently commemorated Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. He was the one who created the meetings of the leaders, council, which is not initially in the treaties, and he was a very, very committed to European integration. And I think it has proven to be good to work on those three legs, if I may say so. On the stepping stone, so not to be we shouldn't be too French, but we should make our presidency a stepping stone in the process of European integration. This sounds good for you. This sounds certainly very good to Italian ears. This sounds terrible to a majority of member states. If we were to do this and to say this is our priority for French presidency, we would be immediately accused by a majority of member states of promoting a French agenda. So I'm just playing with this idea that being not too French, or being maybe in this case very Italian, in fact, is not being European. the point I do take, strategic autonomy, I agree. It has been a very divisive concept, and we probably have some responsibility for it, because we like to throw concepts. And concepts are useful because they trigger these lively discussions, and up to the moment when they become almost an end in themselves, and then we end up debating forever, which is not a problem at think tank level, but it's really a problem when it's at head of state level or ministers level. We end up, the open strategic autonomy, closed strategic autonomy. And so I think we have, because we are France, because we trigger a number of perceptions, we have an extra duty to explain that this is absolutely not a zero-sum game between the transatlantic relationship and European integration. It's actually the opposite. We believe extremely strongly that if the EU remains weak, then the transatlantic relationship is doomed, eventually. And I'm a bit, and it's only by becoming stronger that we will be better partners, more useful partners for the US, and it will be sustainable for the US in the long run. They will see the benefits for themselves of keeping this transatlantic partnership. I mean, I'm not worried at all about the current administration, but do we know the next one or the next ones? So it's important that anybody who comes in the White House can see this is actually a good deal for me. I think it always was, but the more we show that we are taking our share of the burden, the better. And so, in fact, strategic autonomy is a plus, not a minus, for the transatlantic relationship. That's what we think. That's what we've probably not been good enough at explaining. And if I'm honest, I think a number of our partners, if they're convinced that this is really what we want, they'll be on board, but a number will not. A number are very happy to remain weak because they think that's the best way to keep the US involved. And that if we are a bit stronger, then it will give kind of an incentive for the US to distantiate themselves too fast before we are strong enough. And therefore, they'd rather be weak. And I'm struck that sometimes the biggest criticism comes from countries that spend the least on their defense capabilities. But I take the point. I think we have a big work to do to explain that it's complementary. We were helped in a way by a tragic development revolving around an Australian contract. You may have followed this, AUKUS. It was a big crisis, still is to a certain extent, but it triggered a very interesting transatlantic and French-US debate, and it led, I think, the US to signal more clearly than they ever had that they are comfortable with the EU growing in capabilities. Then on the formats, and thank you very much, because I think it's really, really interesting to talk about this. I started this day with the new German foreign minister who took office yesterday, came to Paris for her first visit. The Chancellor will be here tomorrow. So yes, the French-German relationship is unlike any other relationship that comes from history. And when I joined the Foreign Service after Sciences Po 25 years ago, we still had, it was the very, very last time when we had people who had known the Second World War who were in office. And they were very, very afraid that once they go, we would go back towards nationalism. And they very much had this kind of European mindset versus national mindset. And which is one of the reasons why we got the Maastricht Treaty, that Kohl and Mitterrand thought, okay, we are of this generation that knew the war, the horror of the war. We can pull our people closer together. And I deeply respect this courage that they had. That's how we did great things in the post-war period. But 25 years later, what I find really interesting is that those predictions have not come true. So now nobody who is in office, of course, has lived the Second World War. And yet, the foreign minister of Germany comes to France for her first visit. Although Germany, in the meantime, has been reunified, is a global player, and so on, has a capital in Berlin. All the things that were scary back in the day. And I think it's because we have understood, and it's now deeply ingrained in the systems of the two countries. And also every time there has been an attempt at avoiding this, there was a reality check. If we want to be influential in the world, we need Europe. And if we need to move Europe, you just cannot move without a French-German agreement. That's almost physical or mathematical reality.
Clarity and Franco-German alliance.
Yeah. What has changed since the last enlargements, which are already a long time ago, is that it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think President Macron deserves a lot of credit for developing very strong relationships between us and other countries within the EU. And by the way, if we are fine with any club within the EU, even the club that we are not part of, so long as their purpose is to bring Europe forward. Sometimes we've seen a number of clubs that were created just in order to drag or to prevent movement. Sometimes it's been the case of the V4, sometimes it's been the case of the so-called frugals, but there are many clubs that are there, and it's fine and it's good, and I think it helps also explain that you can perfectly combine national, plurilateral formats, EU formats. We've also developed a number of formats within the EU where not all 27 are members, Schengen, Euro, and so on. So I think we'll have a variety of formats, and it's very good and healthy if we develop also stronger bilateral relationships. I was privileged to negotiate the Quirinal Treaty, which we signed 2 weeks ago in Rome. It was a very, very interesting process. If you look at the treaty, it's both bilateral and European. We've tried to articulate the two dimensions. We also have a strategic partnership that we recently developed with Greece. We have a relationship with the Dutch or the Nordic countries that has taken a new dimension, in part because of Brexit. So I think that's very good. We should not be afraid of that. I saw some reactions when we signed the Quirinal, which said, it's really not so good that we go towards this national again. This nations. Progress should be at the EU level. I disagree. I think this is part of creating a much denser fabric within the EU, and I think it's to the benefit of all. To create specific formats, that's a different issue. A formal format, because if you have Franco-German, which I think kind of everybody understands it's necessary because of history, then of course, but if you add Italy, then you have a Spanish problem. If you add Spain, you have a Polish problem. If you add Poland, you have a Dutch problem. If you add Dutch, you have a Swedish problem, and so on and so forth. So you cannot really create a formal format, but you can have a multiplicity of formats also depending on the issues, and that's basically what's happening.
Perhaps just a word on the Conference on the Future of Europe?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, don't misinterpret the fact that I did not react. I was carried away by the Conference on the Future of Europe. Well, one of your recommendations may actually prove to be already followed, because we will see, but I'm not sure that we will close this before the presidential election. Therefore, it's not likely to be a platform for campaigning, which I think was one of your concerns. I think you said, I don't know if I wrote it here, there is both the fear that France will use it, the hope that France will extend it. I detect a lot of fear also amongst member states on not so much the French agenda, but the European Parliament's agenda, which has really, taken this issue of the conference on the future of Europe. You see it also in the governance. It is a bit complex of the process. I think it's in fact a bit early to say because we still have those. Well, by the way, I hope COVID does not affect too much the process of the conference, because that's typically something where you need to have people physically present in order to do good work. How we will close this under our presidency, I don't know, because it depends in large part in work that is still to be done. Certainly, you could see in his domestic and European initiatives that for President Macron, it's this idea to go regularly back to some form of citizens panel, associations, consultations. That's a very strong element in his view. I think it's not against the representative democracy. It's not against the parliament. Neither, at the national level, we had the citizens panels on the green transition, and this was in parallel and in complement with the legislative process. So I think he certainly doesn't want to undermine existing institutions, but actually to inject energy into them. With those citizens mechanisms, and I think that's something that will remain very high in his both in his thinking and probably in his policy if he's re-elected.
Next, I would like to call on Roderick Parks, who is research director and head of the Alfred von Oppenheim Center for European Policy Studies at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and who co-authored the section in the recommendations on the strategic compass that you already mentioned. And you focus particularly in the section on the importance of building civilian crisis management capacity. So can you tell us more about it? Oh, the mic?
We lost it.
Okay, it disappeared.
Cool. Oh, it doesn't work. How do I think it works?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, you're right, Ilka. Real people. Jesus. Okay, so.
It's scary, isn't it?
It's not great. Anyway, thank you, David, for sitting and listening to us, actually properly listening. That is appreciated. My colleagues said to me before I disappeared off to Paris that my job was to try to sell the French the vegetarian option when it comes to security. And I do have to sort of acknowledge that we have taken a slightly unusual line. That we've sort of focused on some of the missing bits in what is already, I guess, quite a sort of broad document, rather than looking at the sort of military strategic core of it. And as Natasha says, the focus a little bit has been the civilian dimension. So maybe before I say what the what is, I will say why the why. Why did we choose that? We know, obviously, that the goal, as you set out yourself, is really to sort of kickstart the EU's development in a sort of political, military dimension. The Germans sort of handed this to you at a time, I seem to remember, when France would have preferred a sort of scenario exercise on what might trigger Article 42.7, the mutual defence clause. I seem to remember a couple of years ago that was what France would have preferred. But equally, the Germans were sort of inviting the French to then set them on a different course. So if I now appear in Paris and say, actually, think of the civilian bit, we're aware that's maybe a bit incongruous. and we know, of course, that the debate at the moment is on this sort of headline goals, like the rapid reaction force and the use of Article 44 on constructive abstention. And also that there are very good real-world reasons to think about the sort of politico-military development of the EU, including the Putin-Biden call. But I think, as an institute, we have been working with the French government on this for a couple of years. So I feel that we've had a conversation with you guys on the sort of military side of things. I think, secondly, we're a little bit nervous that if the document is too sort of responsive to real-world pressures, it'll actually become a sort of diversion from action. And equally, what ought to be a sort of exercise in long-term thinking will be a bit too responsive to sort of, current needs. And the sense was, I think, that maybe the proposal for the rapid reaction force was, a sort of theoretical response to the real-world problem of the Afghan withdrawal. But I think, really what we were keen on is making sure that this process was properly linked into a lot of other processes that are going on in the development of the EU as a sort of security player when it comes to all four baskets of the strategic compass, so resilience, crisis management, partnership, and capability planning. So that was a long introduction. What is the what? Our three recommendations are this. The obvious thing, to combine the strategic compass much better with the ongoing work in civilian CSDP and the idea of a sort of civilian compact 2.0. There is still a tendency, I think, to see civilian CSDP, as I said at the beginning, as the vegetarian option, confined to soft tasks. We felt it was worth remembering that sort of distinction between civilian and military is a bit of an artificial one, and comes, historically out of an agreement perhaps between France and the UK about the relationship between NATO and the EU, and it's worth reconsidering that distinction. First recommendation, hook civilian CSDP into some of the core tasks that the strategic compass has set itself: counter-radicalization, power competition, climate adaptation. Second one, focus on mission impact and rationale. So I think we felt that just as strategic processes can become a kind of substitute for real-world action, real-world action can be a substitute for strategic processes, a sort of, let's do something rather than think about it. And I think that played out in the document a little bit, that the focus when it came to operations and missions was on flexibility and speed, and not so much on impact and evaluation. Every mission and operation ought to be based on an analysis of the conflict and how the EU intends to deal with it. That needs to be anchored, we thought, in the strategic compact, so you have a sense when you're setting up a mission of what you actually want to do with it. So that was our second thing, focus on mission impact and rationale. Thirdly, and then I will stop and disappear, resilience. So we know that it's a fuzzy term, this sort of fourth basket of the strategic compass, and we know that all sorts of bits of the European Union are doing resilience without really a very clear definition of what it means. There was criticism of the strategic compact for going down that route, I think, and adding another layer to it. I think we would say the focus on resilience comes about thanks to the difficulty of doing threat assessments. So you have resilience so that you are prepared for anything, but also because it's so difficult to actually say what we should be prepared for. The contribution of the strategic compass is precisely that, to do a threat assessment. So we would say it is the tool to sort of start linking up all the other things that the European Union is doing on resilience. So really make the strategic compass and its threat assessment the core for sort of pulling together all the other work across different layers and policy fields on resilience. Shut up, Roderick. Okay.
Thank you, Roderick.
Thank you, Roderick. There is there is a lot to chew on there. And I'll do it with a disclaimer. Those issues are closely dealt with by the Strategic Affairs Department, which is another department in the Quai d'Orsay, which means that everything I say can then be proven wrong, which will not prevent me from saying stuff. Couple of points. First, you're quite right, and I think you said it at the outset. Nothing ever works exactly like planned, and it certainly applies also to a number of things we're doing in the security and defense field. So the strategic compass is maybe not exactly what we would have had in mind, but we inherit it, and we intend to make the best use of it in a European sense. Those who follow this know there is this so-called PESCO initiative, a permanent structured cooperation, which initially we had seen as something that could be a permanent structured cooperation between, able and willing states, which of course didn't really mean in our idea that we would have all 27 countries there except Malta. But that's how it ended up. And fine, we readjusted. It's there. It's a very useful tool. We're investing in it. Every wave of projects, we present a lot of projects, and that's part of the European way. You launch an idea, it develops into something else. You adapt to that, and you also create other things. We've launched this European Intervention Initiative, which is actually more of an able and willing construct between militaries. We have launched in Mali. We now have 600 special forces from 10 different European countries. That's something new. It's ad hoc. It works. And I think it shows that on these issues of security and defense, we are actually extremely pragmatic. What matters to us is what works, partly because we're on the ground. So when you're on the ground, you need concrete help on the ground. You cannot really afford to have too much philosophical discussions, and that's why I'm a bit sorry that we come across as ideological on this strategic autonomy discussion, when in fact our starting point is how do we move concretely, which is where I like your idea on the civilian CSDP, because I think coming back to my notion that there are areas where the EU is strong and areas where it must become strong, this is kind of in the middle. And if you look at this notion of sovereignty or autonomy or capability, whatever, it's contentious between European member states when you really look at the security and defense part, because then it brings in the NATO issue, it brings in the transatlantic issue. It's tricky. If you take all the civilian aspects, what is related to trade, investment screening, countering subventions, China could subsidize a company to enter the European market, and we could do nothing about it. Whereas if we subsidize a company to enter the Italian market, then it's shut down by the Commission. So now we have an instrument that will apply to external actors as much as it does to internal actors. All of this now is consensual. And we are really moving forward. There are already new instruments. Others are being developed, and we'll carry this during the French presidency. So the notion that on everything that is related to its market, the EU must be a bit less naive, a bit more assertive, a bit more able to counter aggressive behavior from either states or big companies, I think that's given. Health is very interesting. Health is not an area of competence of the EU, but it has de facto become one because of the pandemic. And if before the pandemic we had come with a proposal of purchasing vaccines at an EU level, starting to think about the areas where we depend too much on non-EU players, it would have been shut down immediately. Now it's totally consensual. So Europe is moving I would say, on what is at the moment the most important, because that's where it already exists. And then what we hope is that it will expand fast into the areas where it doesn't exist enough. And I think the civilian is an interesting bridge, particularly if we see it as a bridge. And I agree with you, the civilian-military distinction is a bit artificial, but many member states are wedded to this distinction. Yeah. And we've had very difficult discussion on, European peace facility, for instance. And in some parliaments, in some member states, it's really very tricky. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind. But otherwise, I think it's fair and really interesting. And I will bring it to the people who are actually in charge of that specific issue. I agree that it's always good, I think, in general in life, to know what you want to do when you start doing something. And as you also hinted, I think the key is on the threat assessment. If we have a joint threat assessment, and a real one, not something fuzzy, then hopefully once a problem happens, you don't need to spend too much time, thinking about, okay, what exactly do we need to do here, because you already have built kind of a common understanding of the problem. Because otherwise, I'm a bit afraid that we'd spend so much time debating on the situation, the specific situation, that we just don't do much, which is the current pattern. So I think that the threat assessment in the strategic compass is key, and it's tricky because I think we have very different ideas of the threat we are faced with. I'm hoping it's actually changing. So if I look at China, for instance, I think a few years back, you would have very, very deep divisions in member states when it comes to China. You still have some, but I would say they are reducing, clearly, in my view. Russia these days is probably helping us come to a consensus on on the threat. Africa was long seen as a threat for the French, but not really for the others. I think in part because we have more and more Europeans with us in the Sahel. I think it contributes to a realization that this is a potential threat for all of us. I mean, if you have in those very big and very underdeveloped areas in Africa, if you have a terrorist stronghold, of course it's a threat for France, but I'm quite sure it would not stop at the French border. And I think this is something that is understood. So, in fact, you can be in Finland and actually have a terrorist threat coming from Africa. You can be in Salisbury and have a threat coming from Moscow. It's natural that countries would be more sensitive and have more expertise about what is on the immediate neighborhood. It doesn't mean they are not threatened, but what is coming from much farther. And I think we're moving in this direction. But there is a lot of work to do to translate this into a strong, clear threat assessment in the compass.
Thank you. So shifting from security and defense to a very different area, which is economic activity of the EU, Francesco Saraceno's contribution deals with fiscal governance in Europe. And Francesco is a deputy department director at Sciences Po's OFCE. What do you recommend to the French presidency in this area?
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to pick up from what you say that the presidency is a balancing act, quite difficult one, between pushing the agenda on existing items and trying to introduce new priorities and new ones. And I think this is particularly relevant in the field of macroeconomic governance, which is mostly a field on which I work on. We are, of course, I don't need to tell you, I don't need to tell anybody in this room that we are at a momentous moment. We're at a crossroads. Okay, we have had the 2 crises in 10 years. They have shown how old the institutions for the macroeconomic governance are, how unfit they are to face the different challenges we have, both in trying to react to major shocks and in trying to push forward an agenda for recovery from the transformation of our economy. You mentioned digitalization, you mentioned the ecological transition. These are all things on which the public hand will be crucial in the next, in particular public investment will be crucial in the next few years. And so we find ourselves in a very interesting moment for somebody who deals with these issues, because we need to rethink our institutions, and in particular we need to rethink the role of fiscal policy. And this is something on which there are a few construction sites that are already open. Some of them before the pandemics, actually. The Commission started a consultation process on the reform of fiscal rules a couple of weeks, 3 weeks before Italy shut down for the pandemic, and then all the other countries followed. And on these things that we are advancing. There are propositions on the field. We are working, we academics are working on that, and policymakers are taking on and already negotiating. And then there are some other things related to fiscal policy on which the discussion should start as soon as possible. And most notably, the decision and the debate on whether we should have at the center, so at the European level, some kind of fiscal capacity. And so this is the point I wanted to make, and so then I can leave space for discussion and other speakers, is that these two discussions, which are one very much advanced, the Commission should come up with a proposition, maybe even during your presidency, or at the very worst in the fall 2022. The discussion on fiscal rules that is very much advanced, and on which the consensus needs to be built, but it's there, and a discussion that still to start seriously on creating some sort of fiscal capacity at the center, at the European level, to make it short, a permanent next generation EU, just to make you understand what we are talking about. It's very difficult to lead these two discussions separated. And so this is where pushing, because the point is we need to have some fiscal capacity, some capacity of governments, for example, to implement public investment plans. Should they be national? Should they be European? If they're national, then rules need to be changed seriously. If they're European, maybe we don't need to change rules too much, because then the fiscal capacity will be at the center, and so on and so forth. So having these two discussions completely disconnected, in my opinion, risks being problematic. So I understand the timing is very different. I repeat, we are very far from even starting to think about a central fiscal capacity, but at least putting on the table the subject, in my opinion, would be a very important contribution of the French presidency.
Thank you very much. Interesting that you applaud, because it is very French. Or Italian. And if we were to make this a big priority, broadcast it as a priority of the French presidency, it's immediately looked at in vast majority of EU countries as exactly what you were telling me at the beginning to avoid, which is to try to force something down the throat of the others because we are French. I don't think I've been very diplomatic so far, but I will be on this one. So you have an hour and 40 minutes to wait to see exactly how the president will phrase this, which I don't know. Because it's a very tricky balancing act, because it's politically extremely sensitive in Europe. I've read 3 times the coalition contract of Germany on this, as I'm sure you have. And it reminded me of Alan Greenspan quip, if you've understood what I've said, it's that I haven't spoken properly. Which is interesting. No obvious red lines, but no open window either. It's kind of probably a result of a debate within Germany as well. if you want a debate to develop there, which is, I think, essential, if you want to move on these issues, then the question for us is how do we do this in a clever way? And I'm quite struck to see the discrepancy between the debate between the economists, the think tankers, and the political debate. I would say the political debate is almost 10 years behind. I think the notion that you must not, of course, harm the growth, I mean the recovery, that there are a number of investments that are really legitimate, that of course you need to have some element of fiscal discipline, but you must be very, very careful if we don't want to have what happened last time, basically after the last financial crisis. I think these are fairly consensual if among experts. They are not yet at all at the policy level. And then, we are sitting on 120% public debt. It doesn't make you the best advocate. I mean, I can understand why it would trigger in some countries the idea that, okay, so some countries have overspent at the national level, and now they are really they want to be able to overspend at an EU level, and so it's also our responsibility to show that we are. When we emerge out of the pandemic, we also have a sustainable budgetary path. So all of this to say that I think, and I was really interested in your paper, I think there is definitely something there. It's a debate that in fact exists, that must develop, I think, quickly. We will see whether the fact that we are going into a new wave, unfortunately, of the pandemic kind of triggers this debate, because a few weeks back still we thought we would be out, and then a number of countries were advocating for a quick return to still the case, but this might evolve. So let's think at the clever way of having this debate develop at a European level between policymakers, and maybe we should start with something that I think is detecting under your watch, the idea that we should invest in crucial technologies for the future, that the green transition, of course, it opens a lot of opportunities, but it's not free. We will have these opportunities if we invest massively. I think this notion is becoming a bit more popular, including in Germany, and maybe maybe it's an interesting starting point of the discussion that you rightly want us to have.
Thank you. We have one final contribution by Hector Sanchez Margalef, who's a researcher at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. And your contribution deals with the EU's Mediterranean agenda, obviously an issue that's close to the heart of French priorities. Which concrete steps do you recommend in this field?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, also the organizers. It is really impressive to be talking here face to face to real people. I need to say that the recommendations were not written only by myself, also colleagues from CDOP collaborated. I'll take the blame, I'll let them take the merit if there's any. So if I can comment very quickly on the Europeanization of the French presidency, it's not that we think that you can impose priorities on the others. We are afraid that you may try, and that you may try.
You may try.
That you may try. Okay. Yeah. And on that, and you can see it on the Mediterranean region, and now it's been solved by the treaty you signed with Italy. But the rivalry between France and Italy when dealing with Libya was a problem also for the European narrative of speaking with a single voice. But with that said, I think that the new agenda for the Mediterranean that was released by the Commission in last February is a very good starting point when you want to look at the region and for the actions you want to implement in the region. And I think that coordinating with the future trio of presidencies would be also a very good idea, especially because when France, Spain, and Sweden, and I know that the Czech Republic is also there, have worked together towards the region, nice things have come up. So also to anchor the Mediterranean in the strategic autonomy, I think France could try to promote a nearshoring strategy that will promote reindustrialization also in the southern shore of the Mediterranean, that will create high-quality jobs, and that will avoid future disruptions in the supply chains as the one we are living now. Also, another thing that I think can and should be within the strategic autonomy is some solidarity mechanisms, la fraternité c'est ça. So we could be prepared, and we can be prepared, and the Mediterranean region can be prepared when some shortage of basic needs come, or there are rises on prices for basic needs. I think this is fundamental to avoid potential turmoils yeah. And the last thing, the last recommendation is that well, the COVID crisis has shown us how important are the public services, and I think this is in line with what France is promoting, promoting a social agenda that will allow extending the l'Europe qui protège à la région méditerranéenne. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, we completely share the spirit, and it's important to note because among the 27, frankly, a lot more countries are interested in the East than in the South, because the countries who are in the East are interested about the East, and a lot of countries who are in the South are interested about the East, especially Turkey. And in fact, we are not so many having this proximity and this interest for the South. That's one. Then when it comes to the East, there is the idea, which I think actually is partly mistaken, that we have the tool, which is enlargement. I think it's actually wrong to see enlargement as the main and only, sometimes only tool to influence our Eastern neighborhood. But it's seen like this by many, whereas when it comes to the South, what is exactly the tool? It's not so clear. Plus, unfortunately, in our neighborhood, we have a number of countries, who are, it's true, in a difficult situation, and you have the migration challenge, let's say. So, in spite of all of this, we are absolutely convinced that our future relies on the relationship we have to our south, Africa, including, of course, Mediterranean. This will be very high in our presidency. We'll have an EU-Africa summit in Brussels in February, because we want not only to keep the spirit, to keep the focus, but we want also to devote resources to this policy. I mean, I think we're at the end. So that's the key there. In a way, we are helped by the strategic discussion, the threat assessment that we talked about, and so on. I think it's more or less more and more understood that problems in this part of the world can affect all the Europeans. Therefore, we need to have a policy. That's good. It'd be even better if there was also a shared sense of opportunity among the 27, that it's not only an area where problems can come from, but huge opportunities along the lines of what you said. So on this, I can quite safely, even before 4 p.m., say that it will indeed be a priority of the French presidency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for what I think was a perhaps surprisingly refreshing open exchange, your engagement with the ideas that were presented on the panel, and I think we have a lot of food for thought now for the panels going forward, where we'll discuss these issues much more in depth. For those of you who are joining us for the next panels, you know it's at a different place, so we actually will need to kind of get up, move out, get some fresh air, which is nice. Take the masks off for a brief moment. and move on to the next place. Thank you very much,
Thank
David
you.
Cvach, for having
Merci.
taken l'exercice.
Merci beaucoup.